Here we are again with the last tier list of mono-colored white decks. I'm back with Samuel.
Hi, everyone.
Some of you guys waited quite some time for that, and I think the white color is the most interesting amongst the 5 colors that we talked about, since most of those decks are, or at least 3 of those 5 decks are very competitive and very well represented in the metagame. So it's interesting to talk about in a way that, we had tier lists when we talked about the red decks, for example, where it was hard to find an S tier deck. In this case, I think it's not hard to find a D tier, but it's hard to distinguish between the very good decks in the top end.
Yeah, we've had a lot of fun with the previous colors. I really enjoyed them. I think the feedback was good too. So I'm hyped to get into these 5 commanders.
Yeah, me too. First up, let's start with a very synergistic card. It is the Fox Light-Paws. We have talked about it in the overall tier list, the 20 cards that we talked about in the overall meta game. Back then, we have to say it is a couple of months ago already. Lumra and Spider-Man were still legal. I think the metagame will look much different now that those decks are gone.
Yep.
My personal rating for Light-Paws has not changed. I would still say it is between A and B towards A tier. I still think this deck is extremely powerful. I would say not very much discovered by the majority of players. People know what to expect from it, but it's a very unique archetype, and people usually, or not all, but most people don't seem to be interested in some kind of Voltron deck or Duel Commander. Then again, if you spend some time dealing with the lines and the sequences in Light Boss, I think you can have very successful tournaments, or like even run this deck on MTGO and have some very good leagues and even trials and stuff. I think if you invest time, it is definitely worth it, and it's not as streamlined as people think. What are your thoughts?
Interesting. I remember you saying, like, we've talked about Light-Paws before, and you have a very high opinion of the deck. I
I
think
do.
I'm convinced by you. My experience against the deck has been pretty good and what I've seen so far. However, I think that's also clouded a little bit by the fact that Light-Paws seems to be a deck that not as experienced players gravitate towards, and you see a lot of beginners playing Light-Paws. I think part of the reason is because it's very cheap to build, and that, I think, skews the results that it gets a bit. And another thing is, I feel like if you play Light-Paws a lot, maybe the online experience is better. I would say the online experience is better, but if you play it in paper, you are doing a lot of shuffling, and
True.
that is a big downside. And, like, even Cloud, where you do already shuffle quite a bit, in Light-Paws, you are doing even more shuffling. Sometimes, you shuffle 3 times at a turn, and then again the turn afterwards. So, yeah. But on a gameplay side, I think it's a strong deck. I think it forces your opponents to keep hands that do something against Light-Paws, and that also means that sometimes you are getting opponents mulliganing a lot against you simply because their deck isn't presenting them with hands that do something against Light-Paws.
Yeah.
So that kind of aspect, I think, is undervalued. And yeah, I would say, kind of in my thoughts, I think the way you've talked about Light-Paws, I would put it in S tier. But my experience against the deck and seeing it, I would put it in B tier. So I think A tier is pretty fine. I think it does pretty well on paper. Sometimes, like, there are cards in the metagame that just do well against it. Slimefoot plays Flare of Malice, and the deck also doesn't fare too well against counterspells. So, yeah, I think that holds it back quite a bit. Now that Spider-Man is gone, I think that was a not the best matchup for Light-Paws simply because you don't have a lot of ways of getting your Light-Paws down without it being countered. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I said in the previous video or in the overall video regarding the entire metagame that it's some kind of a hidden S tier. If, like experienced players get to explore it and really invest the time, then again, I think there are other decks that are more attractive to play, that have more depth in order to take more learnings out of it, and might also be a bit more enjoyable. Because, as you know, even I think that for some people that might seem absurd. I personally think that playing Tifa is more enjoyable than playing Light-Paws. I know that both decks are similarly streamlined. Then again, the mid range plan that Light-Paws plays is more interesting than the one that Tifa is going for, because most of those lists play those ETB disablers and stuff like this, turbo op effect and things. This is one aspect talking about the deck building part that is very interesting in Light-Paws, and it's in many cases very useful to have these cards. We just recently talked about shutting down Flash with Dress Down. You can also shut it down with the 2 mana Flash 1/2 that would also deny ETB triggers.
Mm.
And the deck plays all of that with the cost of cutting Solitude, but I think that's not a big deal. Of course, there are also some more mid-rangier variants that lean into the mono white pool. But these days, honestly, if you want to abuse ETBs, I think Phelia is the way to go. That's not Light-Paws business.
Yep.
So, yeah,
One thing that is kind of underestimated in the deck is that the current list does not play too many new auras.
yeah.
Like, there's every now and then an aura gets printed for the deck that kind of functions as an upgrade. However, the power creep that can and does happen in that category, because 1 mana white auras or 2 mana white auras are just a lot of the time, there are draft archetype cards that doesn't and often isn't going to find a home in any real constructed formats.
Yeah.
So the amount that those auras can get better by is pretty high and will allow the deck to every now and then get an upgrade that is just really good and will just keep making the deck a little bit better. Yeah, you know what I mean. The category that cards are
Absolutely. I
being
mean,
printed in is very open.
you know that I always talk about the day. Now we had, I think the most recent addition the deck had was still not sure how the card is called. The 2 mana Flash Aura that grants Hexproof. Hexproof on Light-Paws is obviously extremely good. And as soon as we get some kind of a CMC1 effect that also permanently applies Hexproof with a condition like, as I always say, Daybreak Coronet, for example, which in a deck like this is not a net negative, then I think we have a problem with Light-Paws. Then I think it really becomes a problem, goes in a Geist direction. Just that, you play a bunch of buffs and stuff like this, and you are able to kill your opponent in 2 turns, sometimes even one shot them, while still maintaining like a very grindy board state. And I mean, the big advantage the deck has in comparison to Tifa is that Tifa is just trying to one punch you, while Light-Paws can just stall the board, gain control, and like it's enough to hit your opponent for 6 or 7 a turn. If you have lifelink, you gain back the life. Your opponent really has to bring something down. It has to be the Flare of Malice in terms of Slimefoot, as you said, or a Chaos Defiler and stuff like this. But even the Chaos Defiler can be dodged with the Hyena Umbra. So that's not too scary, to be honest. Yeah. I feel like it's a ticking bomb. Maybe I'm not correct, but that's my current thought. I pick it up from time to time, play it again. I still think it's, and as you said, it's just becoming better and better. So
It is becoming better and better, but I think there is enough removal spells in the format that do handle Light-Paws, like Edicts, and if Light-Paws does start taking a larger share of the metagame, there are definitely cards that can be boarded in order to fix that situation. Like,
that is,
black decks have a lot of answers. Not many other decks have answers, but that might just mean that, Tazigor boards a couple of different removal spells, and then suddenly Tazigor sees more play because it's good against Light-Paws if Light-Paws sees a lot of play, and then, yeah, you know what I mean.
I
This
know what
kind
you
of
mean.
meta switching can happen, and will if these numbers start changing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, then again, the white pool is also developing. There's Galadriel's Dismissal these days to phase out Light-Paws. There is Angel's Grace, which is played. No, not Angel's Grace. Is it Angel's Grace? No, Angel's Grace is the split second spell, right?
Yeah,
I'm
it's the
I'm
one
talking
we can't
about
lose.
exactly I'm talking about the one that would grant you and permanence protection from red and black. Mm, which would actually, since most of the edicts are targeting a player, apart from the flare. Flare says each opponent, but like a Sheoldred's edict, for example, would say target player or target opponent, right? So that is a move against that direction.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
both card pools are developing, and apparently the deck doesn't seem to be too popular. There are a couple of very seasoned pilots that score great results all over again. But apart from that, does not have like a crazy meta share, and people seem to be annoyed by different decks than what Light-Paws brings to the table. So yeah,
Yeah.
long talk about the Fox. Well deserved, I think. Let's talk about a card that you might have never faced in a tournament or even at your FNM. It's Oswald, a deck that I have followed for quite some time. I also played it a little bit. I was never really convinced. I think it was like from an entertainment aspect, it was one of those decks that we would show on the channel in a focus session, just because it's a really cool deck with really cool lines. But overall, I would say it is very slow in what it's trying to do, and it needs a lot of rather complex combination of cards in order to win the game. I think you have the white CMC3 reliquary whatsoever that bounces a permanent. Then you need the initiative, 4 mana stone. You need Paradox Engine and more things on the board. And the loop is you flood mana and you replay this thing and win with the initiative, which is cool. But in today's metagame, it's super, super clunky. So I think it's not like totally horrible because we're still playing white. White has access to great cards. And even the white affinity deck has access to great cards, I think. I guess I would put it in C tier. It's a bit better than D tier. D tier, I think it's not worthy. But yeah, from my experience, I think it sits well here. What do you think about it? I think, have you ever faced it somewhere?
I haven't faced it. I would put it in C tier as well. I think the artifact pool is good and getting better. Every now and then, there's some upgrades for it, and, you can, if uninteracted with, if you have the correct answers for the interaction that the opponent presents, then Oswald can make it. But yeah, I think part of the downside of building the deck around a commander that has to untap most of the time, and it has to have haste, or you have to untap with it a 2 mana 2/2. There's just not enough resilience on the commander in order to go so far into the commander, which means that if your 99 isn't presenting a game plan that the opponent has to interact with, and can just focus on interacting with Oswald, then you are kind of out of luck. And I don't like to really commit to decks that have that as a baseline.
Yeah, I totally agree. That was also my experience when touching the deck. I was super hyped because there were a couple of sets that brought some improvements. It looked like being a cool deck. And it's not only about the Paradox Engine line. The lists that I know also run Dreadnought into Turbo Orb things, and then you have like a 12/12 trample on field, which is cool. We like to experience those synergies in Singleton. You usually know them from Legacy or even Vintage, right? I think these days it might not be good enough for Vintage anymore, but I'm not up to date with the Vintage metagame, to be honest, so there might be some Stifle Note around still. I think there's like one particular player from the French community who's very much into the deck. At some point, I think he dropped it because it was just not good enough anymore and he was having hard times scoring results. Then again, I think from amongst the guys here, from the three remaining guys, we have a deck that might be even worse. We can talk about that. But let's talk
Yeah,
about a deck that is actually pretty good. The dog, Phelia.
exactly.
Where
I
would
would
you
say,
put it?
actually pretty good. I would put it in S tier. I feel like
Yeah, me too.
when you look at, the top decks in the metagame now, post banning of Lumra and Spider-Man especially, you have these two white titans of Phelia and Cloud, and Phelia is I would say the more versatile version and the one that has a better broad matchup against a metagame.
Mhm.
I think Cloud is a bit more narrow. It does some stuff much better than Phelia, like generating card advantage, but the first Phelia cast plays around sorcery speed removal, which is great, and you can often even delay the first Phelia cast if you're setting up things to enter the battlefield and make it very awkward for the opponent to play around it. And if you think the opponent's holding up interaction, the deck is slow enough and steady enough in order to just say, okay, well, if you are going to kill my Phelia right away, then I just won't cast her yet. And then the opponent's out of timing. You know, the power of having a flash commander in the command zone is something we've talked about a lot and is very present. And the way that the Phelia gameplay kind of warps and is built around that simple fact makes Phelia a really strong and really versatile list and hard to play against. And there are some rule intricacies that some players won't know, that revolve around her trigger and what you can do with it and these sorts of things. There's some strong synergies like Containment Priest and, flickering cards like Solitude or against some decks, Witch Enchanter. Yeah, I would say Phelia is just definitely up there, and you do have to commit to playing a pretty slow game because she the deck does not present a fast clock. But if you are okay with that and okay with just outmaneuvering your opponent and having a lot of removal for whatever they're doing, then I think Phelia is definitely a great deck.
Yeah, I think there's one thing to add. What really pushes the power of Phelia is that Wizards is continuing to create effects that would allow you to cast a card for less of the original casting cost, such as the Overlords. The White Overlord is still a very powerful 4-drop here, but is originally a CMC 7 creature, right? Then you have the Warp abilities. So far, I think there's only the Starfield Shepherd, but still, there is this ability. No one can guarantee if it comes back or not, but it might. And you know how they say everything is kicker. This is some kind of another kicker effect. And it seems that Wizards is thinking about more of these effects to, give people or players more flexibility in terms of when and how to cast those spells. And of course, as we also see in Modern, by the way, there's the deck with Phelia and the Quantum Riddler and stuff, and you have Phelia and you play the Riddler for 2, which is usually a CMC 5 creature, and all of a sudden you have a 4/6 that draws you cards and stuff, Pretty powerful interactions, and here we have that in Singleton. The white pool overall is extremely strong. As you said, this deck is capable of adapting to almost any metagame, which, yeah, because it's so versatile, which makes it extremely powerful. So I can just agree to everything you said. I think it's a well deserved S tier. And we can maybe get back to that when we evaluate Cloud's position. Before we do
Mhm.
that, let's talk about the deck that I spent lots of time 5 years ago, I think. I'm not exactly sure when this guy came out, but it's a couple of years ago. Ratchet, a really cool commander. I thought like the ability, how's it called? I forgot the name of the ability that you can play the backside.
Something vehicles, flip, modular, I don't know, I don't remember.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not even like
Maybe you can check it up. It's still relevant for Flame War. I think Flame War is still the most played transformer in the command zone. And Ratchet was an interesting one for some time too. I felt like back then it was already hard to win games with this deck because it was like incredibly grindy. The card pool for it was not bad, I would say, but the games were just going way too long. You always wanted to connect in order to gain the life, to gain back things. And these days, I think it's more or less unplayable because due to Tazigur and Embry and other things, people are all walking around with ghost vacuums and whatsoever, which makes the trigger non existent.
yep.
And then you're just trying to play probably a worse plan than Oswald is doing because you're not fast enough for the aggressive strategy, even if you cast the vehicle on the backside. There are a couple of one drops that would be super big if you have Metalcraft, for example, the one from Mirrodin, which becomes a 3/3 if you have Metalcraft.
Yep,
Then
or
there's
two
the
craft exemplar.
yeah, I was just about to say the dwarf. or the homunculus, I think it is, from Conflux that would become a 2/2 and stuff like this. The 2/2s in today's metagame, I would say, are even not good enough anymore. If
Yep.
the deck could play 10 or 12 of those 3/3 creatures for 1 mana reliably on turn 2, I think it would be fine, right? But we are not there yet.
Yeah,
And I
and
think
we even have cards like Marauding Mako and Asmo, or Nethergoyf, or Moonshadow. One drops that just on their own will outscale a 3/3 during the course of the game, which
true.
means that you are even like doubly confined to having to play your game plan with Ratchet so quickly, and that just it's just not fast enough for the format. Most
Yeah,
decks
very
will
true.
outscale what Ratchet is doing. It worked in a time when, there were still some more clunky cards in the 99 that would mean that with Ratchet, you often have the ability to present more than what the opponent can handle in the early turns, and suddenly you are doing really powerful stuff, but I think that has fallen off quite a bit. And the ability that you're talking about is Living Metal
Yeah, thank you. Living Metal it was.
or
No,
More
no,
Than Meets the Eye
more than
on the
meets the
front
eye. More than meets the eye.
side,
That's it.
which I get that it's a Transformers thing, very hard keywords to remember. Living
That's true.
Metal, not so much, but More Than Meets the Eye, something that slips the mind very easily.
I should
Yeah,
know better because I played the card for some time, as you know, but
yeah,
it's also quite some time ago. And yeah, unfortunately, not a thing these days anymore. I mean, it belongs to the pack of very synergistic decks, right? Light-Paws is extremely synergistic, so is Oswald and Ratchet too. Not as synergistic as those two, but still, back then I was looping the Dungeoneers package, I think it was called. The bag that would do, I think, a treasure token, you gain life, and if you crack it, I think you gain the initiative or something like this.
mhm,
Cool card. Costs like 3 to play, 2 to activate, way too slow for today's metagame, right? Stuff
yeah,
like this. Unfortunately, we talked about it in the review. We have less and less quote unquote fair synergistic decks. If we have synergistic decks that actually do something in Duel Commander, they are extremely powerful, very efficient, and originally, that should be a good thing to have those decks because that's what Singleton and also especially Singleton Commander is somewhat about. Most of the time, if those decks are too crazy, they end up being banned, as we just had the case with Lumbra, right? And Ratchet is very, very much below the threshold of even being considered like an unfair pile of cards.
yep,
So,
yep.
and I doubt that it's ever becoming better again.
Yeah, there can be cards printed for that archetype that would make the archetype better, but I think what we do need is a commander that does what Ratchet was doing better
Yeah,
than
exactly.
this. I think to some extent we've already got that in an Oswald. I think to some extent we've already got that maybe with a Cloud as well. It's not doing as much with artifacts, but with equipment.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that also takes us over to our
Good one. Yeah,
last commander, which is Cloud. I think anyone who is active in Duel Commander knows Cloud, same with Phelia. It's also an S tier.
I agree.
Because of the tutor on it, it has incredible ability to do a bit of sideboarding and kind of tune its equipment package to the metagame. For some metagames, there isn't as much sideboarding that it can do, but against other decks, you have access to quite a few good equipments that kind of target what opponents are doing. You also have kind of the standard line of paying 4 mana from your command zone to essentially draw 5 cards, tutor a Skull Clamp, and put the Skull Clamp into play and clamp Cloud right away. That means that you can play a very low curve, lots of really efficient spells, and use that to keep going and to keep presenting threats. You have a lot of cards in hand with this deck very often. And yeah, I think there's also the upside of Wizards likes to keep printing into the white equipment matters archetype. Like recently we've seen, well, not quite as recent anymore, but something to like consider is that the deck has had Heli Trooper and Sid from Final Fantasy, which Cloud also came with. But with the Hobbit set, we have the mono white Keeley, which also does strong stuff with artifacts, acts basically like a pure steel paladin, and any game that you hit at an opponent with a cloud that's equipped with a sort of fire and ice, you're probably going to win, and that goes the same with a lot of other abilities in this deck, and it just gets to do a lot and also cheat on mana a lot. It gets to play spells like March of the Otherworldly Light because you just have so many white cards that you could pitch into it, that's an additional Swords to Plowshares often, and yeah, I think it's just very efficient. It doesn't kill very quickly. However, the kind of mid-range plan that you have with it is just so strong that it's definitely an S tier and maybe even better than Phelia because it has a more consistent game plan with its commander. But yeah, I think that's debatable.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting aspect to mention is that there were a couple of players that thought about switching to Cloud in specific matchups. For example, I talked about a potential switch to Cloud against Tifa recently to find a jitter regarding the failure pile. And, whenever you face a control deck on the draw, you can consider to go for failure to have the flashy threat.
Mhm.
I think the failure swap in Cloud is not as good as the other way around,
Yep.
since Thalia needs a specific build around to some extent in order to be good. And Cloud has to pack a couple of synergies around the equipment thingy, right? Like you mentioned, the new Pure Steel Paladin or things like that. And then you play the equipments themselves, which means I don't know what the average cloud is currently running in terms of like number wise, how many artifacts it runs, how many equipments it runs. But I would assume at least 6 to 7 cards, like Skull Clamp, 2 swords, and then maybe a few others, maybe less. I don't know. But those are cards that are not going into the failure synergy, right? You have to make like deck building constraints in order to get there, and that might be like a small disadvantage. If we talk about the potential swap, there might not be a need for that. When we did the 20 commander tier list regarding the entire metagame, I said that it's an S tier deck. I still think it is an S tier deck. A big upside here is the Skull Clamp line. It is, for many lists, it's like the main build around, right? Generating lots of card advantage and finding the right pieces that the white decks can pack in order to tackle different matchups. That's still the case. Skull Clamp is still here. I don't think it will leave us, although you could debate about that, but that's for another day. Yeah, and that just makes the deck overall very solid, very consistent. I should actually touch it. I said that last time. I was aiming to play it in the future. Now I'm swimming with the frog in the pond
Mhm.
and enjoying control decks much more right now. But at some time I will come back to Cloud and Failure, I guess, just because mono white decks are very powerful. I also like the fact that we have very, very powerful decks at the top of the format that are, in comparison to other decks, relatively budget friendly, I would say. I mean, there is City of Traitors, which is a big hit for sure, and there might be some equipments, or on Felia's side, a couple of more includes. Sometimes you see when Lumra was very present, then Felia decks played Ravages of War and Armageddon. Armageddon is a €5 card. Ravages of War is like 70 to €100. In the US, might be even more, right? So that's the thing.
I think you're forgetting a printing. There's the Fallout printing of Ravages of War. If you're
All
fine
right.
with that,
Okay, yeah.
then
True, true, true.
you can play that and it's like $20.
I still have only the original printing in mind, and then there was the promo, the foil promo. But you're true. There,
Yeah.
there was a
Yeah.
Fallout printing, which
Yeah.
reduced the price in
25
fact.
€25. But
Yeah, that's okay.
I also agree, and I think City of Traders definitely helps. I think it's possible to not play it.
I think so too. Yeah.
If you're at a tournament, then City of Traders is like the last piece you can get, and before that, I think the deck is probably not quite as expensive.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean,
Still gonna be costly like every Duel Commander deck, but not as crazy as many of the decks where you have to have duels.
yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, there are some situations in which City is like crucial, right? If you're on the play and you play Cloud turn 2 and you have a deck with which you want to search for a jitter, for example, playing and attaching jitter on turn 3, going for an attack and having 4 triggers on the jitter is crazy, right? And Crystal Vein, I don't know if the decks run Crystal Vein. I think they do. Phelia does too. And City do enable those lines. But as you said, if you cannot afford it, you can also just buy like the bulk percentage of the deck. I don't know, I think there are like 40% or something that are not very expensive. And you can just try it out. And if you enjoy playing the deck, then you can further lean into investing into it. Overall, I said it many times. And that's also why we did this entire series here. It's cool that we have so many different monocolored decks performing at the top of the metagame, because it's always great for new players to have like a very low budget threshold to enter the format, right?
Yeah.
That's a really good thing.
Yeah. Looking at the deck right now, I just picked a random version that looked okay. It's on Moxfield, it's 540 euros without the city and close to 1,000 with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, depends on how much you're invested in Magic. For some players, 500 euros is a lot. Others say, yeah, well, my legacy deck costs 5,000.
yeah,
500 is totally fine, right? Depends
yeah,
on how much you're invested in general. But yeah, it's an okay entry price. If you want to play Slimefoot because you think, well, jump mid range is what I want to play, you have to pay much more simply because of the duels already. The land base is much more expensive or makes the deck much more expensive. So that's definitely an argument. Okay.
yeah.
I think we arrived at the end of our white monocolored tier list. There will be a sixth session, as promised. I think one of our members actually had an idea to pick like the 5 best decks of the color categories and then reevaluate them in the entire metagame.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, interesting concept.
Yeah, I think so too. This will be the sixth and final version of the monocolor tier list. I think this will be a very interesting video. We have to see who is the new green leader since Lumra is gone. I think it will be Tifa.
Yeah, I think it is Tifa.
Yeah,
And currently, I would say that red doesn't get a spot, and that we are looking at 2 white spots is kind of my thoughts on that. But we'll see how.
we can debate about that. We don't want to bully the red players. You know, some people are hoping for a return of red decks now that Spider-Man is gone and one less Glacial Chasm deck and stuff like this. And maybe it's a time to bring back Virgo or Kellen and stuff. You know, you never know. So
True.
we'll see about that. All right. With that being said, thanks a lot for tuning in, guys.
And see you next time.